Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Carissa and I am the director of Considerate Pouchers in Sweden. And joining me here today is Theo Herold, PhD student at Hanken School of Economics in Finland. So we are here to have a conversation about snus and nicotine pouches in Finland, which has become a very heated discussion in recent days. So Theo has been very involved in the debate and has voiced his opinion in several articles. So we are very glad to have him here today with us to help sort out the details. So Theo, can you go quickly ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is a really relevant topic, especially in Finland and in the context of the Nordics, but also in general when we're sort of heading towards a smokeless future. And it's very nice to be invited to this and to talk with you and such an important organization as Considerate Pouchers. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Theo Herold, and as you were said so nicely in the introduction, Carissa, I'm a PhD student in economics at Hanken, which is a school of business and school of economics in Helsinki, Finland. And while I sort of primarily focus my research on what we within economics call industrial organization, I also have a keen interest in sort of urban economic topics and behavioral economics. Now, but that's obviously not sort of relevant for this conversation and sort of one topic I keep, no matter how, not that I actively try to stray away from it, but no matter how what I do, I sort of keep coming back to the topic of nicotine pouches and snus and sort of smokeless tobacco. And this is something that for me has been very close to my heart for a very long time, because I think snus, in my opinion, is sort of the least damaging form of nicotine intake available to the public. It allows for sort of minimization of public health expenses, increases tax revenues, and allows for people to transition away from smoking and sort of other harmful forms of nicotine intake that both damages themselves and the people around them. Snus and nicotine pouches allows people to sort of move away from those alternative forms. But I think, particularly in Finland, it's very interesting because we're so close to Sweden. The use of snus is quite high, yet the selling of snus is illegal. It'll be interesting to talk about this today.
Perfect, thank you. I'm very happy to have a Finnish person so knowledgeable about the situation to bring us some clarity. So as you said, and if I've understood it correctly, selling and buying snus has been illegal in Finland since 1995, yet it's been growing in popularity. So why are people choosing to use snus in Finland, and what is going on in Finland right now to bring up this topic?
So snus has grown in popularity quite immensely, I would say, the past decades. Today, it's approximately 7% of men and 4% of women who use snus daily. And to compare, I mean, it was 1% for both genders in the year 2000. So this 7% of men and 4% of women translates to approximately 125,000 people in the entire country. And if we then look at the number of daily smokers, we see sort of the opposite trend, where approximately 1/5 of the population smoked in the year 2000 and only 12% now in 2020. So it's sort of clear that popularity is growing, and I don't think you can sort of pinpoint one specific reason for this, but my sort of anecdotal evidence in this is that I think people are starting to realize how much of a better alternative using snus or nicotine pouches is to for instance smoking. And especially amongst younger people, you see that snus is much more popular. And I think that sort of walks hand in hand with this increased focus on sort of well-being, fitness, and just general health which sort of in itself has been a trend during the 2000s. But I think also other things contribute to the popularity of snus and nicotine pouches, such as sort of its accessibility. So even though it is illegal to sell snus in Finland, you can still fairly easily get it either by traveling to Sweden, buying stuff tax-free, or even and maybe this is something we'll get into later in the conversation, but even on sort of black markets and on social media. Now I think just in sort of the Finnish context of it all, the Finnish government has this sort of vision that Finland should be smokeless by 2030. And kind of tragically, it also includes snus, even though we know that snus is not, I mean, you're not smoking anything. So to include it in sort of this one category of a smokeless Finland, I think is quite misleading. And I also think it's a shame that the government wants to view snus as a part of the problem rather than a solution to actually achieve a smokeless Finland by 2030. I think the selling of snus and nicotine pouches would be arguably the most effective thing the government could do. Finland also, I think, in again the Finnish context, a new government was elected right before summer, and they've it would seem to be that they have sort of more liberal leanings with regards to snus and the selling of snus, by, for instance, allowing the sale of nicotine pouches under 20 grams of nicotine. This was something that was also essentially banned prior to this new government. But yeah, we will see what happens on this topic.
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear the good news that you have a government who realizes the potential of snus and nicotine pouches, even though the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health maybe hasn't yet. Doing research, I saw a very interesting quote from the leader of the task force who put forward the suggested reforms. I might not pronounce this correctly, but Ilkka Oksala, who stated...
That was good. That was really good.
Thank you. He stated, while the use of cigarettes has lowered in all groups of society, the usage of snus is increasing. Snus has started to replace smoking. We need to take action against that, and we need to do it now. End of quote. And I mean, it's scientifically proven that the health risks of snus are minutely small in comparison to cigarettes. And in this quote, it seems like snus is the devil itself. So how did Finnish so-called experts end up here? Is there any resistance to these claims? I mean, Finland has such tremendous potential to follow in Sweden's footsteps in becoming smoke-free. So why are they choosing to go in the opposite direction?
That's a really good question. And I can sort of, for context, start off by sort of touching upon what the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health did. So in the beginning of 2023, there was a task force for the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health that presented essentially a package of reforms with the explicit goal of reducing daily smokers to less than 5% by 2030. And then one of the reforms within this package of reforms was to completely prohibit the import of snus to Finland, which then would entail that Finnish citizens could not travel to Sweden, for instance, buy some snus and bring it back home to Finland. They would be the snus would be confiscated by the border or at the border. Now, at this point, this has only been a reform package, so it's not something that's necessarily entering into law or anything that sort of becomes actual policy. But I think it's also very naive to think that just because it's a task force and a reform package that it would not necessarily enter into law. There are. I mean, this is a ministry with quite the amount of sort of sway amongst the decision makers in Finland, and so just the fact that this report has been presented and this reform or this reform suggestion is on the table, I think is could be quite detrimental for snoozers and users of nicotine pouches in the future. I would say that there is some resistance to these claims. I think if the same ministry in Sweden were to make these claims, I think there would be a public outrage, which is not the case in Finland. And I think the reason for that is that both Finland and Sweden are Nordic countries, and we sort of have this fascination for public health and public health of the population, which is in many ways rooted historically. I mean, that's part of the reason why we have, for instance, government monopolies on gambling, the selling of alcohol, and a lot of other things. And while snus was used in Finland and produced in Finland prior to 1995, before Finland was a part of the EU and the selling and production of snus in Finland was legal, it never sort of had the same status as snus does in Sweden. Snus in Sweden, it's still a Swedish product, and there's sort of this kind of patriotic sort of not message, but this sort of patriotic perception of snus in Sweden. It's a part of Swedish culture, and that was never a part of or that was never sort of the Finnish way of viewing snus. So I think Finland, once Finland decided to join the EU, or we're at sort of the brink of joining the EU, and one of the requirements was that the selling of snus should be prohibited. I think Finland was that's part of the reason why Finland was very quick to sort of just accept the requirement, and why Sweden, on the other hand, was not willing to do that and sort of fight for the selling of snus. The perception, I would say, is also kind of generational. The perception of smokeless alternatives and nicotine pouches and snus, and just from sort of an anecdotal perspective, I've had quite a few sort of back and forths on op-ed pages in Finnish newspapers, where I've tried to argue from different perspectives ideologically, based on research and other sort of perspectives on why it would be good with the selling of snus in Finland. And usually the backlash I get comes from, well, first and foremost from medical personnel, but in almost exclusively every case from medical personnel, either doctors or nurses or what have you, that are from a much older generation, and they usually cite research that tends to have quite a few years on them, published before the 2000s, and there's this sort of general reluctance to sort of absorb the new science that has been produced, that talks in favor of snus, and that basically shows that snus is not as harmful as previous studies would suggest. Now, there's also within political parties, I would say, more and more members of parliament are starting to look at the current ban of the selling of snus and realizing that it might be counterintuitive, but I think there we still have a long ways to go. I think it's either one or two parties in total. I know the Swedish People's Party and then the sort of the leading party at the moment, who's formed government, that are for the selling of snus, but yeah, there's still some ways to go to get sort of the political backing for this.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is very interesting. I mean, it's so deeply rooted in the Swedish culture with snus, so that of all the things we could get an exception for while entering the EU, we were like, oh, snus, that's the only thing we need an exception for. I think that's super interesting, and a bit sad that Finland wasn't fighting for the same thing, because they could have seized the opportunity while Sweden was fighting it to get the same exception, but yeah, that's in the past. So I'm glad to hear that there is some resistance, and I mean, thank you for being out there fighting on the op-ed pages as well. That really makes a difference in bringing light to the topic. So based on what you're saying and the fact that the snus popularity is growing in Finland, with the current situation, with the selling of snus being illegal, what are some of the effects of the prohibition? Do you know how much the Finnish government loses in tax revenue to the selling of snus being illegal?
Yeah, so the way it sort of works today is that a Finnish citizen, or essentially anyone traveling to Finland, is allowed to bring in 5, we call them stokkar or logs of snus, and 1 log contains 10 cans. And so you're allowed to bring in 5 logs of snus per day. There is, and as we were talking about earlier, since 7% of men and 4% of women use snus, there is a considerable market, which also has made it so that snus is quite a hot commodity on black markets in Finland. And there are criminal gangs. Primarily, this is at least what has been reported in media, criminal gangs that are primarily either rooted in or come from Estonia and or Russia. That sort of essentially dominates the entire black market. There are some private sellers, but these are quite few and far between. And then the black market sort of flourishes on social media, in different groups, on different forums. And then you sort of, yeah, regardless of which city you live in, pretty much in Finland, there is always a specific group on certain forums that you can join, and that has a dealer that can provide you with snus. And so one of the sort of major things the government could do to combat this ever-growing black market would, of course, be to legalize the selling of snus. But looking sort of past that, and this was also sort of rooted in the question you posed, tax revenues. I actually looked at the numbers and tried to sort of calculate how much the Finnish government loses every year on tax revenue, and how much is sort of recouped on the black market. And what I did sort of a, I mean, in many ways a crude calculation, but I think still gives sort of a fair pointer as to how much money we're actually talking about here. So given that we assume that snus would be legalized in Finland and would be taxed exactly the same as cigarette packs, that would sort of imply that you have 9 cents or euro cents per snus pouch, and then 52% of the retail price is taxed as well. And then on top of that, you add a 24% value added tax. And then given that we assume we take the most popular snus brand in Sweden, which for I think a couple of years now has been a brand called One White. The retail price in Finland would be approximately 6 euros, somewhere along those lines. So then if we conservatively assume that the people use 3 cans of snus per week, it would total approximately 100 million euros per year in lost tax revenue, excuse me, in sort of total revenue from the sale, of which 70 million approximately is lost tax revenue. And this is, of course, I would say a conservative estimate, because I think people who use snus use more than 3 cans a week. And given the fact that I think a lot of people, if the opportunity to use to purchase snus legally was presented, they would be willing to pay more as well. So I think the 70 million in lost tax revenue and 100 million in sort of total selling revenue or in total sales is quite conservative. And given the fact that on black markets prices tend to be even higher, this is instead money that directly goes into the pockets of these criminal gangs. And I think an additional consequence, it doesn't get talked about as much, but it's kind of growing within sort of the discourse on the effects of snus being illegal to sell, is that many of the sellers on the black markets today tend to also sell other things, should we say, that are even more prohibited to sell. And so especially younger people who tend to want to buy snus and get in contact with these sellers they also get in contact with a bunch of other narcotics and the likes. Now there hasn't been any sort of official number look or investigation into if this is as big of a problem as I assume it is, but I still think that the best thing the Finnish government could do is work towards lifting the ban of the selling of snus and nicotine pouches, and this is for multiple reasons.
Yeah, I mean, wow, 70 million euros is a lot of lost tax revenue.
It's a lot,
with
yeah.
a lot, and with considerable side effects, both for the society and the individual, since that money could be used elsewhere, for example, in healthcare. So that is super interesting. But I would like to jump on another topic. So we've talked a lot about snus. So how's the situation with nicotine pouches? Is there any ongoing discussion about that?
Very good question, and actually highly relevant. I'm now sort of crudely just whenever I talked about snus, I've tried to mention nicotine pouches, but the conversation thus far, I would say, has been primarily about snus. But nicotine pouches is very much relevant at the moment in Finland, which primarily stems from a sort of period of confusion that happened it was around April or May, where the Finnish Medicines Agency just overnight, without any sort of there was sort of no reason to anticipate that this decision would come. Overnight, the Finnish Medicines Agency just declared that nicotine pouches are no longer to be categorized as medicine, which essentially sort of in practical terms just lifted the ban on the selling of nicotine pouches. So basically overnight, you could all of a sudden buy nicotine pouches online, and quite quickly following this announcement, stores and kiosks around Finland started selling nicotine pouches. And there was this sort of period of confusion of, wait, is this illegal if I'm now buying this? And politicians were kind of reacting to it as like, what is going on here? How should we approach this? And then in the end, I think it was at the end of May, if I'm not mistaken, regulation was passed that sort of restricted the selling of nicotine pouches to be up to max 20 milligrams of nicotine per pouch. So before that, anything was basically allowed to be sold as with regards to nicotine pouches. And this is the situation we're in right now in Finland. I think personally that this is an enormous victory. It's an enormous victory for public health and just for the freedom of choice and yeah, a step in the right direction for increased tax revenue as well. But I think it still remains to be seen sort of if this 20 milligram cap is going to stay in place, and whether or not the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, their suggestion sees the light of day, and if that's the case, sort of what would that mean for the selling of nicotine pouches? So I think that there's a lot of people within politics and policymakers currently looking over this and trying to sort of see what can be done. But for the time being, at least, I view this as an enormous victory for snus and nicotine pouches.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking in Sweden, I think it's interesting because we have the same cultural concept of snus and nicotine pouches. So while they are regulated differently, we kind of see them culturally as just a variation of the other. Do you have the same in Finland?
That's a good question. I would say so. I think people sort of view nicotine pouches as sort of it's an innovation of snus essentially, and it's nicer. It doesn't look as sort of it doesn't look as sort of crude or doesn't give sort of the same associations to tobacco because it's nicotine only, and so I think in a way, yeah, kind of similar as in Sweden, but then it's I haven't seen the numbers, but if I would have to guess, I think that the popularity of these of nicotine pouches the past 3 or so months has grown quite immensely. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of former snoozers who still aren't able to buy snus in Finland have actually transitioned away from snus to exclusively nicotine pouches.
Mm. Yeah, that's the same development we've seen in Sweden. It's played a huge role in decreasing smoking rates since its introduction, and has been reaching new audience who didn't like traditional snus. So it helped them quit smoking too. And that's certainly good news that the same might be happening in Finland. So fingers crossed that it will continue to be legal there. So there's a lot of people who use snus and nicotine pouches in Finland, as we've established, who have recognized their potential to help people quit smoking. So can politicians really ignore these consumers? What's your outlook on the future of snus and nicotine pouches in Finland?
I was actually, that's a really good question. I was initially of the camp that once the Finnish Medicines Agency passed or not passed, but basically lifted the ban, my immediate reaction was, okay, if any politician now tries to sort of touch this, and what I mean is sort of reinstate the ban, that it would cause an outcry, because I think a lot of people have been waiting for such a long time for this to happen, that once it does happen and they would do sort of a bait and switch and be like, oh, this was only temporary. I think that would have been quite a disaster. Granted, it might still happen, but I just have a hard time thinking that it will. I think now that nicotine pouches have been, the selling of them has been allowed, I think that's going to stay the way it is. And I think the ball was put in motion by the Finnish Medicines Agency by allowing this. And politicians currently, I think, are sort of cautiously trying to monitor the situation and sort of see how people react. Initial reactions, and sort of by all accounts, from what I've read, the stores that have started to sell nicotine pouches have made a lot of money on it. There is a clear demand for it. I think for a lot of people, being able to move away from sort of the uncertainty and sort of the hassle that comes with trying to buy from a dealer, to actually being able to go to the store to buy this, I think that plays a huge factor as well. So I think the current legislation will stay in place for the foreseeable future. I think it's here to stay, and on the contrary, and it pains me to say, I don't think we'll see a complete legislation of snus in Finland anytime soon. But I mean, of course, that could change. But I think just through the selling of nicotine pouches, that sort of demand for snus has kind of died down a bit, because we still get a very nice substitute to snus from the store. And then, of course, the suggestion by the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health on a complete import ban, it could still be relevant. Something could happen where this sort of snus import ban would be instated, but I think that it will slowly fizzle out over time. And I think, sort of as an eternal optimist, I would say that the current situation is miles better than what it was in Finland before 2023. Even during Corona, you saw the prices on the black market started soaring because borders were shut, and all of a sudden the supply of snus in Finland was kind of limited. So I think the situation we have now is much better. And I think I at least hope that policymakers and politicians realize that the future is smokeless. Moving to a sort of smokeless future is inevitable, and any sort of or any sort of attempt to kind of prohibit people from acquiring healthier smokeless alternatives to cigarettes is just politicians delaying the inevitable. So my personal hope is that the goal of a smokeless Finland is a smokeless Finland where people are still allowed to use snus and nicotine pouches freely.
Yeah, and I mean, for a complete what's it called, free legislation on snus. That's something that has to come from the EU level, since that's where the regulation is posed, and that's usually a bit more difficult. But maybe they can part ways with Sweden and try to make it possible on a European level as well. But I'm super happy to hear about the recent changes and nicotine pouches being widely available in Finland, so that they can have a better alternative to cigarettes. And in the end, it's lives and lives saved for people who can stop smoking. Well, thank you so much, Theo, for being with us today and answering all of our questions and shedding light on the situation in Finland. It's been really interesting to hear what you have to say on the topic. If anyone wants to follow you and your work, or get in contact with you, where can they do that?
Thank you very much for having me. This was, as I said in the introduction, this was very nice and a very important topic, and it's nice to see considerate pouchers and what you guys are doing on this topic. I think it's very, very important. I am on Twitter, which is just my first name, Theo, Theo _Herold. And then just in sort of the kind of typical academic circle. So I have my own personal webpage and a Google Scholar site, but those are the social medias I tend to use.
Perfect. And we'll add the links in the description as well. So on behalf of Considerate Pouchers, we are very grateful for having you today. And thank you to all of you who has been watching this video. And it's a pleasure to have you here today.